And again, once again, good afternoon. I am Mike Serra at the League, and we are here today with the Department of Community Affairs on the new lead-based paint hazards and the new inspection requirements. Specifically, we are joined by Kaya King, who is the Director of Policy and External Affairs for the Department of Community Affairs. Thank you, Kaya, for being here. And Marie Daniels, who is a program specialist for the regulatory program at the Code Development Unit in the Division of Codes and Standards. And they are the go-to people on the implementation of the new law, Public Law 2021, Chapter 182, which is effective July 22nd. They will get into the details of what that law is and what you need to know about it. This is a follow-up to a lunch and learn that we did about a month ago, which is on our website as well. So with that, and to get to the programming, I want to turn it over to, I guess, Kaya first as well. And again, thank you both for being here today. It is much appreciated on a lovely Friday afternoon in the summer. So thank you both.
Thank you so much, Mike, for having us, and welcome everybody. Happy Friday to you all. Thanks for joining, and we're looking forward to giving all of you a detailed overview of the requirements of Chapter 182. Marie's pulling up the screen right now for a presentation. And I want to make sure to note, because we have been getting in some questions and inquiries from various municipalities about information on which level of inspection their town is set. So we have been able to publish on our website today a listing of all of the municipalities and what level of inspection, whether visual or dust wave. Marie, if you wouldn't mind dropping that link in the chat, I just want to make sure we share that with our attendees today. We'll also be sending out a notice through various internal processes just to get this out to local health officers, construction officials, and also through our LGS folks, just to make sure that you all have that information. And without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. I will say we'll probably try to take a brief break just to take some initial questions during the presentation, and we'll have a few minutes at the end to take questions. And you will also find, if after this presentation, maybe you and your team are thinking about this, you have follow-up, our last slide will include a direct email to submit your questions to a dedicated address just for this law. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So lead-based paint hazards. So it's important to note really the foundation of this law, the importance of it, and why we are where we are today. And understanding lead and its associated hazards is a good starting point. So for those that may not be aware, lead is a naturally occurring element. It's a heavy metal that exists in our environment. Historically, lead was used in a variety of products, particularly industrial products, commercial products, gasoline, paint, cosmetics, spices, and pottery. Throughout the 20th century to the present day, it has been determined by various health experts the negative impact and harmful effects that lead has on human physiological and behavioral health. Because of that understanding, we've shifted, I think, our course just culturally and where we are with the times on lead risks. Lead exposure happens when people encounter lead in their environment. So that can be through numerous sources, right? Household paint, contaminated soil, or other sources. And exposure is determined by measuring the concentration of lead in one's blood. And I will note that while there's various sources of exposure for lead, for those that have carefully read the legislation, this legislation specifically speaks to lead-based paint hazards, right? So we're not really addressing soil or other sources of exposure point under this act. Lead exposure occurs when lead has been introduced into a person's bloodstream by ingestion or inhalation of lead dust. Unfortunately, our bodies can't distinguish lead from other minerals, calcium or otherwise. So accordingly, lead then gets deposited into our organs as well as our brain and bone marrow. And it's important to note the Center for Disease Control has set the threshold for elevated blood lead levels. And they've also have reported various findings about what impact lead exposure can have, particularly for children. Which I think was certainly one of the many motivations for getting this law enacted. This includes, but is not limited to, nervous system damage, kidney damage, learning disabilities, decreased intelligence, behavioral issues, speech and language problems, hearing damage, decreased muscle and bone growth, and poor muscle coordination. And for those that have been around children under the age of 6, the risk of exposure is particularly high for them as well as for pregnant women. It's important to note that any lead that a pregnant woman is exposed to can transfer to the fetus and is present at birth. And small children, of course, have a higher rate of hand-to-mouth contact. If you've ever been around a toddler, I'm sure you all are aware they love to put things in their mouth, their hands, and anything else they can get their hands on. So their ability to have lead exposure is greater because they're going to end up touching lead dust, eating lead-based paint chips if they're peeling off the wall, chewing on windowsills, door frames, or any other surfaces that contain that paint. So how do we identify lead-based paint hazards, right? What are the considerations, especially for your staff that are going to go in and perform these inspections? So it's important to note deteriorating lead-based paint, so peeling, chipping, chalking, cracking, damaged paint. Those are all considered to be hazards or red flag, and that would require immediate attention. It may also be a hazard when it's found on surfaces that get a lot of wear and tear, right? Think of our windows, windowsills, doors and door frames, stairs, railings, banisters, and porches. So any of those areas in a dwelling that really get a ton of traffic and can cause deterioration over time. It's also important to note lead dust can form when lead paint is scraped, sanded, or heated, right? So dust also forms when paint surfaces rub or bump together. Lead chips and dust can stay and reside on surfaces and the objects that people touch. And then what can also happen is that settled dust can re-enter the air when people vacuum, sweep, or walk through an affected area. So that's an important consideration to keep in mind. So pivoting a bit to what is PL 2021 Chapter 182, right? The reason for this important session. So this is a law that's concerning certain lead-based paint hazards in residential rental property. This law does impose an obligation on municipalities to perform or hire certified lead evaluation contractors to perform inspections of certain single-family, two-family, and multiple rental dwellings for lead-based paint hazards. And we're going to go over those dwellings during this presentation. A municipality is to permit a dwelling owner or landlord to directly hire a certified lead evaluation contractor for this purpose. If there's a hazard that's identified, the owner of the dwelling is to remediate the hazards through abatement or lead-based paint hazard control mechanisms. And we're also going to go over that in the presentation today as well. Individuals are certified as lead inspectors and risk assessors, lead abatement workers, and lead abatement supervisors by the New Jersey Department of Health. And this would be an important time to note that we do have 2 colleagues from our Department of Health, our sister agency, Dr. Siobhan Pappas and Morgan Patrick. So they will be available as we get to the Q&A section. But again, it's important to understand the distinction. DOH certifies the individuals that perform this work, the assessors, the risk assessors, inspectors, workers, and supervisors. And DCA, our department, certifies the lead evaluation companies. Here's some links and information. We'll also be sure to share this PowerPoint so you all can click accordingly and have access to those lists. So what is Chapter 182 in terms of the dwellings, right, that are applicable for this act? So we noted before single family rental dwellings, 2-family rental dwellings, multiple rental dwellings. It's important to note because we have seen some questions on this, right, in the full purview of what's applicable for a dwelling under the act. Whether an owner uses a licensed real estate agent to rent the property, or if the dwelling is situated with commercial uses, the law still applies to all rented single family, 2-family, and multiple rental dwellings. So that includes rented condominiums and co-ops, right? This also includes any owner occupied properties where there is a unit being rented. Even if someone does purchase a pre-1978 home and they want to rent it out in the future, that's when this law would be triggered. So we've talked about what's covered under the law. Let's talk about what's exempt, right? What's going to assist you and your staff with knowing what is not required to be inspected under this act. So any dwellings that were constructed during or after 1978 are exempt under the requirements of this act. Dwellings that have been certified to be free of lead-based paint in accordance with regulations promulgated by DCA NJAC 517-3.6. Dwellings with a valid lead safe certificate issued pursuant to this law is valid for 2 years, and during that period, those dwellings are exempt from inspection. Lastly, single family and 2-family seasonal rental dwellings, which are rented for less than 6 months in duration each year, and by tenants that do not have consecutive lease renewals. Those are exempt. Keep in mind, though, that this exemption does not apply to seasonal multiple dwellings. And I know we've noted here in this listing, we've talked about a lead-free certificate and a lead-safe certificate. It's important to note, and my colleague, Ms. Daniels, will also go over this as well, that a lead-free certification, when that's applied to that dwelling, that means that it is always exempt from inspections under this law. So if a dwelling undergoes renovation and in the process is certified as being lead-free, they are no longer required to have to undertake inspection under this law. They are permanently exempt. So continuing on, dwellings that are exempt under this act, multiple dwellings that have been registered with DCA for at least 10 years and have no outstanding lead violations from the most recent cyclical inspection performed on the multiple dwelling under the Hotel and Multiple Dwelling Act. So it's important to note that all multiple dwellings constructed prior to 1978 and registered with the department for at least 10 years have a certificate of inspection that would be issued by our department and the Bureau of Housing Inspection. They are exempt from this requirement. Also, a certificate of inspection means that there are no outstanding violations for that dwelling. Next is a multiple dwelling that has been registered with the department for at least 10 years with an open inspection, but that open inspection has no violations for paint. That's also exempted from the act. Open inspections mean that inspections are ongoing to remediate violations during a typical cyclical inspection. During that cyclical inspection, it's important to understand that the department cites paint violations rather than lead violations. In order to ensure that a periodic lead-based paint inspection occurs where needed, any open paint violation in a dwelling unit will necessitate compliance with this act. And I think at this point in time, I'm going to turn this over to my fantastic colleague, Marie Daniels, who's going to talk about periodic inspection and the various associated responsibilities. Marie, take it away, and thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having us and joining us today. So this is going to start getting really into the, I guess, meat and potatoes of this law, all of the different requirements as you start to implement this. So we're going to start with the responsibility for the periodic inspection. And there's a few ways that this can shake out. The first is going to be a municipal inspector. So this is for any municipality that maintains a permanent local agency for the purpose of conducting any inspections or enforcing laws, ordinances, and regulations concerning buildings and structures. That agency is responsible for performing the required inspections. Now, depending on the way a municipality is structured, this can look a few different ways. So there is some discretion amongst municipalities for what agency will actually be charged with performing this inspection. One thing I wanted to note, this is not a requirement of the law, but it is something that could be very helpful over time, is that if municipalities have a lead inspector risk assessor on staff, that person absolutely has the training to go in and perform these inspections. It's not something required by the law, but it is something just as a touch point that a municipality can utilize. The second option is a lead evaluation contractor. Now, this applies for any municipality that doesn't have the permanent local agency, as just discussed. Any of those municipalities will actually have to hire a lead evaluation contractor to perform those inspections. So lead evaluation contractors are the firms that are certified by our department, the DCA, and our website actually does have a list of all of those evaluation contractors. Thirdly, this option applies regardless of whether or not the municipality has a permanent local agency. A landlord or owner can choose to have and hire a certified lead evaluation contractor to perform the required inspection on his or her unit. So those are the ways that the responsibility shakes out. Now, along with that, there's also a procedure deadline, and the time that you have to start performing these inspections is absolutely paramount to making sure that we meet the requirements of this law. So all rental dwelling units are required to be inspected pursuant to this law within 2 years of the effective date. This law comes into effect on July 22nd, 2022. So we're coming up on the effective date or upon tenant turnover, whichever is earlier. So that would mean, of course, that the first inspection must take place no later than July 22nd, 2024. And that would be in your long-term tenancy situations where that tenant is staying there from this effective date all the way until July 22nd of 2024. And then also there is a procedure for the inspections. So depending on what threshold you meet, you will be performing a different type of inspection. That's what Kaya mentioned earlier. And this information is available on the department's website. I will drop a link in the chat in a little bit. But the way that this plays out is that in a municipality in which less than 3% of children tested 6 years of age or younger have a blood lead level greater than or equal to 5 micrograms per deciliter, the inspection may be carried out through a visual inspection. Those municipalities that meet that threshold could still undertake dust wipe sampling if they would like. However, they have the option to perform just a visual inspection. And I will get into what a visual inspection looks like in a couple of slides. On the other hand, for dwellings that are above that threshold, so in those or in municipalities where at least 3% of children tested 6 years of age or younger have a blood lead level greater than or equal to 5 micrograms per deciliter, that inspection must be carried out through dust wipe sampling. So any municipality where at least 3% of children have an elevated blood lead level, you're going to have to perform a dust wipe sampling. The option for a visual assessment is no longer there. And I will also get into what a dust wipe sampling will look like. But before we move into that, it's important to understand how often these inspections are going to need to occur and what the actual timeline and responsibility is. So for any unit that needs to be inspected pursuant to this law, after your initial inspection is conducted, the unit needs to be inspected for lead-based paint hazards every 3 years or upon tenant turnover, whichever is earlier. The only time an inspection upon tenant turnover is not required is if the owner has a valid lead safe certification. And as Kaya noted earlier, lead safe certifications are valid for a period of 2 years. So there's a bit of an allowance there. There's a tenant turnover in that 2-year validity period, and inspection is not going to be required. However, if the lead safe certification has expired before the 3-year inspection is supposed to take place and there is a tenant turnover, there is going to be a required inspection. I know that sounds confusing. The important thing I've kept in my mind is that an inspection upon tenant turnover always resets the clock for a 3-year inspection. And we've made a little timeline to try to spell this out more clearly. So as we know, the 3-year inspection is always going to be scheduled from your most recent inspection, which resulted in a lead safe certification. So what this might look like is, say you do your initial inspection on July 1st of 2024, and thankfully the property is lead safe. They're issued a lead safe certification that's valid for 2 years. They're scheduled 3 years out for their next periodic inspection. So keeping in mind their certification expires on July 1st, 2026. Let's say a tenant moves on October 1st of 2026. So we are outside that lead safe certification period. It's officially expired. So now a tenant turnover inspection is necessary. Thankfully, the municipality goes in, the property is still lead safe, and a new lead safe certification is issued and is valid for 2 years. The next inspection is scheduled 3 years out from that October 1st, 2026 date. So the next inspection is set for October 1st, 2029. However, understanding that the certification now expires on October 1st, 2028, if the tenant moves out after that period, the dwelling will need to be inspected at that time. I know that's a little bit convoluted, so we're going to move now into the types of inspections that are going to be performed on this periodic basis. So the first is for the towns that are allowed to perform visual assessments. This inspector should be looking to examine rental dwellings for any deteriorated paint or visible surface dust, debris, or residue. So, sorry, paint is deteriorated when it is peeling, chipping, chalking, or cracking. Tacking holes or any small hairline cracks or other surface imperfections may not be considered deteriorated paint, but of course use your best judgment because any kind of hole in the wall can lead to a bigger crack over time. So inspectors should be looking for deteriorated paint on all painted building components, especially walls, windows, and trim. You should also have careful attention to any surfaces that experience friction or impact. So surfaces that slide across each other or strike one another, because that painted surface can become deteriorated more easily. Just like Kaya said earlier, think of your doors, windows, floors, and trim areas. Anything that's experiencing motion on a day-to-day basis is likely to have deteriorated paint quicker. Inspectors should also look for paint chips or dust from painting activities that were not properly cleaned up, and so it's on the floors, because that can be a hazard, of course, for small children. There's also dust wipe sampling, and dust wipe sampling is collected by wiping a representative surface, including floors, whether carpeted or uncarpeted, interior windowsills, and other similar surfaces, and testing in accordance with a method approved by HUD. These samples have to be undertaken properly to ensure that the results are accurate. So NJAC 5:17, which is the department's requirements for lead evaluation and abatement, it does contain requirements for dust wipe sampling, and the HUD guidelines for the evaluation and control of lead-based paint hazards in housing also provide protocol for sample collection. And of course, it is recommended that where dust wipe sampling has been performed, you should also be doing a visual inspection, because though you've wiped down, if there's deteriorated paint, there's also another issue that could be in play here. And of course, the question I'm sure everybody has are the fees for inspection. So in accordance with the new law, municipalities must charge the dwelling owner or landlord a fee sufficient to cover the cost of inspection. So for any municipalities that must hire a lead evaluation contractor to perform the inspection, this fee should include the cost of hiring that contractor. And just to give a very broad brush example of what this may look like, this is not a set in stone fee, but we received information from our division of housing for what a lot of dust wipe sampling looks like price-wise, and it is often priced at around $360 per unit, but that price can fluctuate based on the cost of supplies, the time of the inspector, and the cost of testing those samples. So it's something to keep in mind, kind of a loose guideline, an example of what this might look like, but it's nothing set in stone. In addition to that fee, each municipality must also assess an additional fee of $20 per unit inspected. That is meant to be deposited into the Lead Hazard Control Assistance Fund. This won't apply if the department has already assessed this fee. And when the department assesses that fee, that's all for the multiple dwellings, because that's assessed at the time of their cyclical inspection. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're in a multiple dwelling that is not exempt from this law, it will also likely need to be assessed that additional $20 surcharge fee unless the department has assessed that fee. So of course, following the inspection, you'll have the results of your periodic inspection. So on one hand, if you have no lead-based paint hazards and you determine that there are no lead-based paint hazards in the dwelling at the time of inspection, you will issue a lead evaluation, or the lead evaluation contractor or local enforcing agency will issue the lead safe certification, which is valid for a period of 2 years as discussed. Now, this PowerPoint has a very small picture of the lead safe certification. This is available as a fillable form on our website. This will be provided to both the owner and the municipality for everyone's record keeping purposes. Record keeping is something we'll discuss down the road, but this certification is a vital piece in understanding if a unit has been inspected and how long that unit is cleared for any tenant turnover inspections. On the other hand, of course, you may find lead-based paint hazards. And if a lead-based paint hazard is found during the course of your inspection, the owner of the dwelling unit must remediate the lead-based paint hazard by using lead-based paint hazard control methods or interim controls and abatement. And if lead-based paint hazards are found during the course of a visual assessment, the owner of the dwelling may elect to order dust wipe inspections to confirm the presence of lead-based paint. So that's just to do a very thorough check. Now, if lead-based paint hazards are found and work is required to be undertaken, it is very important that that work be performed by a certified individual in accordance with all applicable state and federal regulations. Now, we've already gone through who DCA licenses and who the Department of Health licenses. So we have our firms and our individuals. There is also the United States Environmental Protection Agency, which certifies renovation, repair, and painting contractors. These firms are certified to perform, again, renovation, repair, and painting projects. Pretty straightforward. These address lead-based paint in homes and also in childcare facilities. This work is often involved in interim control methods, so we've also included the website for EPA's RRP program. I also wanted to point out that when remediation work is underway, there are often questions about whether or not the tenant is able to reside in the unit should lead be found during a period of tenancy. And the answer to that is contained within 517. Those are our rules for lead hazard evaluation and abatement. Usually the lead hazard or the lead abatement contractor, evaluation contractor, can make the decision as to whether or not the person can reside in the dwelling during the time of remediation work. And any relocation, of course, if it's necessary, would have to comply with the relocation law. I don't want to get too into the weeds with that, but it is something to keep in the back of your mind if there is a tendency when a lead-based paint hazard is found. So the first way of addressing any lead-based paint hazards is interim control. And interim controls are methods that are designed to temporarily reduce any human exposure to lead-based paint hazards. Interim controls are often easiest and most appropriate to use when fixtures are completely structurally sound and lead exposure is really just coming from deteriorating paint or excessive levels of lead in household dust. Interim controls are also often utilized if a unit will either be demolished or even just renovated within a few years, because that way you're just keeping the unit safer. You are reducing human exposure to lead-based paint hazards, and the investment in a more costly abatement is not merited if you'll be undertaking renovation. So interim controls can look like a few things. One of the main forms of interim control is paint stabilization. So that would mean that you're taking all deteriorated paint on, that should say, interior surfaces, and it should be stabilized in accordance with HUD guidelines. So taking any of your deteriorated, cracked, chipping paint and making sure that it is no longer cracked or chipping, painting over it, making sure that it is stabilized in accordance with HUD guidelines. There's also making surfaces smooth and cleanable. So that's anything like your floors, stairs, and interior windowsills that are rough, pitted, or porous should be made smooth and easy to clean. This is, of course, so dust is not settling into those little pores or cracks and then sweeping back up into the air when people walk by or they vacuum. So a lot of times this is minor surface damage and you can fix it by spackling or recoating. You may have to cover or coat the surface with a material like plastic or sheet vinyl, but that's only if it's across a wide area. There's also just correcting dust generating conditions. So HUD guidelines include necessary measures for correcting dust generating conditions. On the other hand, abatement is necessary in cases where interim controls are not likely to be effective. So especially if the building has a substantial structural defect or if interior walls or major components are seriously deteriorated or subject to excessive repeated moisture. In those situations, abatement is more appropriate since it is more permanent. So that looks like paint removal, which includes the removal of any lead-based paint by mechanical methods. So that includes wet scraping, wet sanding, and non-abrasive blasting. Now it says wet scraping and wet sanding because it's very important not to create a bunch of lead dust when you're performing abatement, because the purpose is to remove the lead, not to send it into the air. There's also building component replacement, which includes the careful removal of any building component which contains a lead-based paint hazard. It's important to note here, of course, that a new component cannot be brought into the working area until all dust generating activity is completed and has been cleaned. That's just because you don't want to be exposing the brand new component to any of the old lead hazards. There's also enclosure, which includes enclosing the lead-based paint hazards behind other materials. So think drywall or fiberboard or any equivalent for an interior wall enclosure. Now, if it's in an area that experiences a lot of moisture, you may want to get a moisture-resistant green board. You're going to have to use that to make sure the lead isn't seeping immediately through walls that are not moisture-resistant. In addition, you'd also have to cover any old flooring with a 1/2 inch or thicker plywood before any other floor covering is added. And that's again to prevent lead from seeping through the new components. So now that a remediation has occurred, the reason I wanted to go through each of those methods with you is because after it's been completed, whether it's through interim controls or abatement, whoever performed that initial inspection will have to do an additional inspection within 60 days to ensure that there are no further lead-based paint hazards. So now that we've gone through the types of abatement, you know what to look for. You should be seeing new components or smooth, cleanable surfaces. So if you're conducting a reinspection in a dwelling that was remediated using interim controls, you'll go in, perform the inspection, and if no lead-based paint hazards are found, the municipality or the inspector must certify the dwelling to be lead safe pursuant to the law with that lead safe certification. Now, on the other hand, because abatement is a more involved and serious task, it includes a UCC permit, Uniform Construction Code, then the lead abatement clearance certification has been issued by the local enforcing agency, and that lead-free certification will exempt the unit from future inspections pursuant to this law. Just like Kaya noted earlier, it's that distinction between lead safe and lead free. It's vital here. An abatement will always result in a lead-free certification issued by the enforcing agency after a lead abatement contractor has performed a clearance examination. And with that, I recognize that I have just dumped a ton of information on you. So we are going to take a quick break, take a couple of questions before we move back into just some best practices.
All right. All right. Well, thank you. And I guess this is intermission.
Yes.
So Frank Marshall of the league staff, our associate general counsel, has been monitoring the chat box, and I also see someone has their hand up. So why don't we start first? Matthew Cavallo, I see you have a hand up. Do you have a question? I mean, meanwhile, Frank will start compiling the questions from the chat box.
Thanks, Mike. Can a municipality who has a local enforcing agency, a uniform construction code department, hire a lead evaluation contractor to do the inspection instead of the municipality?
Sorry, Kaya, you're muted.
You would think after all of these, I would have figured that out, but it wouldn't be a Zoom without someone messing up on the mute button. Apologies. So, Mr. Cavallo, so as we had looked as a department at this law, if you look to section 437.16, section B2, this indicates, or actually, I'm sorry, B1, the requirement sets forth that a town that does have that permanent local agency is required to perform the inspections. So, you know, even if for the sake of argument, there's maybe some challenges with bandwidth, the way the statute is written, if that town does have that permanent local agency, they are required to perform the inspections under the act.
Okay, so let's do questions for about 5 minutes, and then if you have more presentation, we'll go back to it, and then we'll get back to questions. Frank, can you chime in, please?
Yeah, so I'll start here with a question from Jason Hooper. What defines a seasonal multiple dwelling? I think this goes back, Kaya, when you were speaking.
Thank you. Marie, would you be able to speak to this a bit further? Because I suspect you have a better sense of it than I would.
Of course, this is one kind of usually a loose definition, but the law actually does give the parameters for what's to be considered a seasonal rental. And it's that it's limited to 6 months rental period. So it's not rented for any more than 6 months during the year. And there are no consecutive leases. So it's not rented to the same person in that 6 months duration back to back.
Okay, I'll move on here to another question. Can a building inspector obtain the necessary license to perform the required inspections?
So yes, they can. What I will say is that if there's an interest in a particular certification such as lead inspector, risk assessor, I will turn this over to my colleagues from DOH, who I hope are on the line, but they may be able to speak a little bit more to that certification and the interest of a municipal employee getting that type of certification done. Dr. Pappas or Morgan, are you on?
I'm on. I can handle it. So hi, everyone. Thank you for having us today. So yeah, so they would be able to, if you have a someone who has done some type of inspection and housing and things like that prior, they would be able to, you apply for the lead inspector risk assessor class, you take the class, and then you take the state exam. And if you pass the exam, you send in for your licensure. So the class is about 5 days long. Did that answer your question? They're quite, they would be allowed to take it, yes, as long as, you know, they have some type of inspection. Doesn't have to be for lead, it can be for other types of inspection.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you so
think
much.
that gets to the question. So I'll move on to another one. Towns which use DCA for construction official services will have DCA inspect for lead, or do we have to hire an outside entity?
So I'll speak on this briefly and then Marie, feel free to jump in. So what I will say is that if you do not, if that town does not have a permanent local agency, then they would be able to hire a certified lead inspection contractor. Marie, feel free to add in anything I've missed.
No, you hit the nail on the head with that one. In going over this law and all of the ways it could be read, we figured that permanent local agency really does mean an in-house agency. So if you're offshooting your construction enforcement to the DCA and you don't otherwise have a permanent local agency that could get into buildings to do these inspections, then you would have to contract with a lead evaluation contractor.
Next question is one that we've gotten a lot of here at the league, but is there a model ordinance for municipalities to adopt?
Thanks for that question, and it's a good one. So we are talking internally based on some of the feedback we received from the first lunch and learn and some questions. So I can't give a specific answer on for sure if we're going to issue an ordinance, but we're talking internally about that. And what we can do is once we make a decision, we will be able to follow up to members of the league and to all the various external stakeholders. And of course, if we do prepare a model ordinance, it will be available on the website and we'll let folks know accordingly.
All right, I think this is related to the last question. It might have a similar answer with the DCA performing inspections, but if a municipality has the county fire marshal conduct their rental and sale inspection, who is responsible for conducting the lead inspection, the fire marshal or the municipality?
That's a great question. You know, the law really speaks to municipalities as having that responsibility. But I think it's important to note, and I'm sure all attendees could attest to this, every town in New Jersey is different. And I think towns are structured differently and counties are structured differently. Some bit of guidance that we've tried to give on this is that we're encouraging towns, counties to engage in shared services agreements to try to lessen the load on inspections, right, with your staff. So what I will say is it probably would depend on what would be the most comfortable structure for that municipality and the county. The way the law is written, the onus is on the municipality to conduct. But again, if there was some understanding that individuals from county level fire marshal, for example, could assist on the inspection, so long as the municipality is ensuring the inspection requirement is met under the law, that could be a reasonable compromise point or you know, adaptation to this. Marie, feel free to jump in if I'm missing anything.
You're all good again.
Okay, so another question, can municipalities require by ordinance that rentals conduct the inspections themselves using a lead evaluation contractor?
That's a great question. And I'm not trying to be obtuse in not answering it, but that could come into, I think, an assessment from a legal standpoint and a legal insight on this a bit. You know, the way that the law is written, it really gives kind of two buckets of options for conducting the inspections. And if you have that permanent local agency as a municipality, you are responsible. Setting forth an ordinance that could you know, restrict in some ways or, you know, take away that inspection burden. I would have some concern about that. So what I'd like to do is we'll talk internally about that and probably follow up with some more formal guidance, because I don't want to say definitely no or definitely yes, because that's an important question and an interesting one we haven't been faced with yet.
If I can, this might be a good time to pivot back if you have any more formal presentation comments. And I know we have some colleagues from the Department of Health on this as well. So I don't know if there's any comments if they want to chime in. I want to give them an opportunity to speak as well. So we'll pause questions. We'll get back to them as best we can. But if you want to pick up again with that, where you left off.
Absolutely, Mike. And before I jump in, Dr. Pappas, Morgan, any comments you want to just note right now, or we can feel free to supplement at the end. Completely up to you both.
I think we should supplement at the end.
Excellent.
You're doing a great job.
Thank you so much, Doctor. So now we're going to turn over to some best practices and record keeping considerations, right? Critical information for you all to know as municipalities. So record keeping is important and critical under this act. Municipalities are required to keep track of all rental dwellings subject to these requirements, their inspection schedules, and whether lead-based paint hazard has been found. So again, keeping those meticulous records is critical and key, not just for municipalities' ability to meet the inspection requirements, but also just to have so that if DCA does need to look into making sure that the requirements of the act are being fulfilled, that municipalities have the paper to back up that they've been responsive to the requirements under this act. In addition to the inspection schedule, municipalities are to maintain a copy of any lead safe certifications in their records for the property. It's important to note that municipalities have an obligation to keep records. So the law does require, and the forthcoming regulations also require, the need for a tenant or buyer to be given a copy of the law and the record keeping consideration. So please be sure to keep that in mind as well. And what I will note is, it will be critical to just make sure that for your record keeping, recognizing that there may have to be some collaborative efforts amongst the local offices, right? Getting verification on inspections for some of these properties. So thinking thoughtfully and carefully about the source and who's going to hold these records will be important to having success in meeting the requirements of this act. Now we're going to turn to the investigation requirement under the act. So municipalities are authorized to conduct investigations and issue penalties to enforce a property owner's failure to comply with the requirements of the law. If a municipality does determine that a property owner has failed to comply, the property owner has to be given 30 days to cure any violation by ordering the necessary inspection or by initiating remediation efforts. If that dwelling owner has not cured that violation within 30 days, the owner shall be subject to a penalty not to exceed $1,000 per week until the required inspection has been conducted or remediation efforts have been initiated. And when we say remediation efforts are considered to be initiated, that is when the owner has hired a lead abatement contractor or other qualified party to perform the lead hazard control method. And then pivoting a bit, I wanted to just note that under the act, investigations can also be conducted by the Department of Community Affairs. So whether it be by a complaint that's filed with our department or of our own accord, with direction from our commissioner, Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver, the commissioner is authorized to conduct investigations and issue penalties against a municipality for its failure to comply with the act. The department will give a municipality a period of 30 days to undertake that necessary inspection and provide proof in the form of a valid lead safe cert or notification that lead-based paint hazards exist in the dwelling and that remediation will be initiated. If a municipality hasn't cured that violation within 30 days, it shall be subject to a penalty not to exceed $1,000 per week until the necessary action has been taken. So at this time, we are finished with our presentation. I know there's a number of questions. We have about 15 minutes or so left in the program. And if it's okay with Mike, we're certainly willing to kind of take all these questions, circle back and work with the league to provide more formal written response for any questions that we don't get to today.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The questions are also being recorded separately. So we will have a record of questions that we don't get to as well. So with that, do you want to pivot back to questions now for the remainder? Okay.
Certainly.
Then Frank, can you pick up where we left off?
Yeah. So one of the questions here is, what about owner-occupied two-family dwellings with one of the units rented out? I'm assuming the question is, does that need to be inspected?
That would be correct. That's the correct assumption. So if any dwelling within that, or with any unit within that dwelling, excuse me, is rented out, then that would be required to be inspected.
We have another one here. Can you say more about the required certification of the person performing the inspection, whether a municipal employee or an employee of a lead evaluation contractor? It was stated that the Department of Health certifies risk assessors, lead inspectors, et cetera, but wouldn't training under HUD's visual assessment training also be suitable for performing a visual assessment? Or DCA dust wipe training for dust wipes, et cetera?
Oh, thanks, Frank. That's a great question. So what I will say is that the HUD training is appropriate and can be utilized. It's important to note, I think there's a distinction with private third-party contractors, right, to perform these inspections versus municipal folks. So Marie, I'll let you chime in on this. I know we had talked a bit briefly during your portion of the presentation.
Yeah, but in short, Kaya is spot on. Those HUD trainings for visual assessments and for dust wipe sampling are absolutely appropriate for municipal inspectors. It was kind of a bit of, reading through all of our existing regulations as we worked to implement this law, because this law didn't reference exactly what kind of training a municipal agent would need. And further, when we looked at our department rules at 5:17, it does specifically state that municipal employees do not need to have the certification under the department. However, we do recognize the need to be able to look for the right things when you enter these buildings, so that you are properly protecting any occupants. So that's why the HUD training really is appropriate and would be a great vital step in ensuring that you're looking for the right things and you're sampling the right way.
Another question here, the 3% statistic that determines the inspection type, how long is that valid? And is the DCA responsible for providing that statistic? And I'm assuming any updates.
Thank you for that question. So that information is assessed on an annual basis. DCA does not generate that information. I will turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Pappas, if she wants to comment further, but we do get that information through our cooperative and collaborative engagement with Department of Health, and we will be able to put those figures out annually in terms of whether the town is a dust wipe town or a visual town. And Dr. Pappas, I see you unmuted.
Yep, that's true. So that's what we did, and it will coincide. Actually, it should be approximately November of every year will be the new, it'll be the updated information, and it's based on state fiscal year, right? So the fiscal year ends, so anyway, the fiscal year ends on June 30th. So that while we produce our annual report and we have to clean the data and things like that. So it will be available in November of that year, every year.
Right, and I did just drop the link to our website in the chat. I don't mean to take up where people are asking questions, but that website not only includes our guidance and an FAQ, it also now includes the municipal listings for what type of inspection will need to be undertaken for every municipality.
Okay, I'm just going to combine a couple of questions here. How do I find a class to take to become a certified lead inspector, and when will these classes be held?
That's a great question. So I'll let my colleague, Dr. Pappas, speak to it a little bit further, but DOH does provide certain courses. There are also private companies that can provide certified training, but Dr. Pappas, feel free to jump in.
Sure. So there's actually, it is DOH certifies the companies that are allowed to teach the classes. So they are, there's 4 companies currently and that are allowed to do the initial lead inspector risk assessor training. And that actually is located on the DOH website.
Thank you, Dr. Pappas. And actually, Marie, if you wouldn't mind, I think we have a link that we can drop in the chat so it's easier for folks to reference. That Dr. Pappas and Morgan have provided. Thank you for that.
Just give me a second. I'll try to. Looks like all the relevant questions that we have right now. I mean, I do see the other questions about. Well, there is one. How do we set up an account for the fund? I'm assuming that's the $20 fee that needs to be collected.
So Marie, I don't know if you want to speak to that with the fee. I don't want to misstate what would be the best guidance on that.
That I also don't mean to be obtuse, but that is a good question. I think I need a more fiscal minded person within the department to give me more information about how towns can set up that link, because I know that the Lead Hazard Control Assistance Fund is a state maintained fund. So I will have to follow up and figure out how towns can make the link from their fees to that fund. And that's
Thanks.
something we can get information out on, because of course that will be important.
So we'll be sure to follow up with you all, and obviously with the entire universe of folks in the state, that this information would be appropriate to have back. So thanks for your patience as we get that information back to everybody.
Yeah, and unless anyone else has any other questions, I think that wraps up what we have right now. And again, we will, we do have a recording and a copy of these questions, so we'll try to do our best to put it into one sort of concise document with everyone here and try to get that out to the folks that attended. We do have another one that just popped up. We'll just wrap this up. So how are cities, towns under contract with county for health services affected by this new law? In other words, is the municipality or the county obligated to conduct these inspections? And, I think this might have been answered already, but if you want to just reiterate here.
Certainly. Thank you, Frank. So again, I think I would note that, if we're talking in this instance, right, and this is just with what I'm hearing in this particular example, if we're talking about a town that does not have a permanent local agency for the purpose of conducting inspections and enforcing laws, ordinances, and regulations concerning buildings and structures within that municipality, then they can hire a lead evaluation contractor. In terms of that engagement with county health, again, I'd like for us to talk internally about that. And that may also be something that I think as a town, you'd want to work with your respective county to find if there's some compromise point in terms of shared services for them to continue to assist to help that town meet that inspection requirement. But I will make sure that we note this as a question to really assess internally so we can get some more formal guidance back out to everyone.
Oh, here's another question that just came in, and again, I know I said the last one, but we'll make this the last one here. Our municipality does not have a formal list of rental properties other than the property landlord registration forms, and this does not necessarily list how old the houses are. Is there guidance on ways to gather this information? We use DCA for all of our building inspections.
So that's a great question. So what I will say is we are working internally to really help assist towns with identifying concentration areas. I can't get into specifics as it's still underway, but we are going to try to make sure that we have publicly available information that would note concentration points so that it will better assist addressing housing stock. Again, I'd encourage that as a municipality to look at your housing inspection records, and I would say, in terms of just general best practices, taking a look at your housing stock in a town and really seeing first, what are all the pre-1978 properties, right? There may be other nuances, right, within those properties, but that would be, I think, a critical starting point. Marie, any other supplemental information we can note on this?
This is very supplemental, but one place, if you're not sure where to look to find housing age, often like municipal tax records will include on property information when that property or when that structure was built. So that can be a first step in even just figuring out what's my universe of dwellings that fall under this.
All right, I guess we've answered all the questions as best we can. Again, I think there was some, I don't know if it was a comment about the questions being available. Maybe there's a way based on what the questions that we got here, maybe to develop a, I don't want to give work to anybody, but maybe an FAQ that so we'll talk to you separately about that. Maybe this is a way we can post on both our websites or supplement what's already up on the websites as well. Yes, well, I don't know if the PowerPoint is available or not.
Yes, we can make that available, Mike.
Okay.
What we'll do is we'll send over, I think we had updated some information, and particularly with the link for the list of towns that's way for visual. So Marie will send that over as a PDF. That's certainly available. And absolutely, Mike, we have welcomed these engagements and getting these questions. So we have an FAQ. It's a little bit thin. So we're planning to get that beefed up, and utilizing the questions that you all provided will be of great assistance. And Mike, we'll talk offline about even trying to figure out a league specific FAQ to share with your members as well.
That'd be great. I appreciate it.
Sure.
All right, so we'll wrap up first. So thank you, Kaya, Maria, Dr. Pappas as well. Again, and to everyone who joined us today, giving up an hour on a nice Friday afternoon. Sure, we would all rather be at the shore, but we have important work to do. So again, my appreciation to the Department of Community Affairs and to the DOH as well. This recording will be available on the league website with additional materials within about a business day or so. So again, thank you all, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.